All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. On behalf of the Gates Global Policy Center, the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and the Clements Center for National Security, welcome to today's National Security Forum. I'm Joe Maguire, Executive Director of the Clements Center, and we are honored to have all of you with us this morning. Throughout the day, this conference, featuring Secretary Bob Gates and other distinguished leaders, notable practitioners, diplomats, and scholars, will examine how diplomacy, economics, intelligence, technology, and history shape America's ability to lead without an over-reliance on military force. So let's get started with the keynote conversation entitled The Return of Strategic Competition. I'm honored to introduce two men who need no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. The Honorable Robert M. Gates, former Secretary of Defense and former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the former Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security, and now Provost and Executive Vice President at the University of Texas, Dr. Willem Bowden. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Admiral Maguire, and can y'all hear me okay? Okay, great. And great to be back here. In my previous role as the director of the Clements Center for National Security, we had a number of other Texas national security forums over the years in this same room, so it's a real treat to be back in this capacity. And of course, to be doing this conversation with Secretary Gates, who, among his many other accomplishments and distinguished career, was the keynote speaker for the first Clements Center launch dinner. So this is 12 years later. I hope you can see whatever you said that night, it seems to have worked. We're still around. Right. So before diving into our conversation here and a number of questions I prepared for Secretary Gates on the current national security landscape and how we think about today's threats and challenges and opportunities, because our theme is national security, but because we're doing this at a university, I can't help starting with a joke I heard from the Secretary many years ago, which kind of ties these themes together. So, Mr. Secretary, I don't know if you remember this, but it's very vivid for me. The first time he and I met was 18 years ago in early 2007 in the White House Situation Room. I was serving on the National Security Council staff for the Bush administration, and he had recently left the presidency of a certain community college down the road, Texas A&M, right? And had returned to Washington as Secretary of Defense. And this was during a very difficult time for American national security with the Iraq War and War on Terror and other things. And so I was a backbencher in one of the NSC meetings in the White House Situation Room, and afterwards went up to introduce myself to Secretary Gates. I'd admired him from afar for a long time. This was our first time meeting, and as someone whose own career mind traverses academia and national security, I just wanted to ask, I said, Mr. Secretary, how's this transition going from being the president of a major university to now the Secretary of Defense? And he said, well, what's the difference between a terrorist and a tenured professor? I said, I don't know where this is going. I said, what is that, Mr. Secretary? He said, you can negotiate with a terrorist. Anyway, to any of my fellow tenured faculty in the room, as your provost, I'm sorry, but I couldn't resist. And I look forward to negotiating with you on whatever we have coming up. So, all right, let's get started here. Mr. Secretary, you, of course, continue to be young and healthy and vigorous as always, but it is the case that your national security career spans several decades, including the Cold War, the post-Cold War era, the September 11th era, and now our complicated current moment of a great power competition. With that historical perspective, having worked on, navigated all these challenges for those many decades, how do you evaluate the severity and complexities of the national security challenges America faces right now compared to previous eras? Is it really worse and more scary and more complicated now than it's been before, or how would you compare it?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be back with you, and it's great to be on the stage with you, Will. I think that we are living in perhaps one of the most, if not the most dangerous period in our modern American history. For the first time, we face nuclear-armed adversaries in both Asia and in Europe, both of which are aggressive and have revanchist aspirations. For the first time, really in 200 years, we're facing an adversary that has more industrial and manufacturing capability than the United States. For the first time, we are facing a country that is as technologically advanced as we are in many respects, ahead of us in some areas and nipping at our heels in others. And a country that has extraordinary shipbuilding capabilities. We have 0.1% of world shipbuilding capability in the United States. The Chinese have half, 50%. Between 2017 and 2024, they built more than 300 warships. We built 17. And in the midst of all of these things, we have a government that is paralyzed and has been paralyzed for a number of years. This is not something that's just happened in the last year or the last 4 years. It's been going on for quite a while. So that's why I believe this is such a perilous time for us.
Well, let's dive in on some of the specific challenges that you had touched on there briefly. So you began your career as a Sovietologist. For the young people here in the room that was studying the Soviet Union, the erstwhile Soviet Union, and you're a lifelong expert on Russia, Russian history, Russian culture, Russian strategic thinking. How do we make sense? How do we understand Vladimir Putin? What are his strategic goals? And then what do you think will be the future course and maybe eventual resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think that Putin believes that it is his personal destiny to recreate the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. And as one of my mentors often said, Brzezinski said, without Ukraine, there can be no Russian Empire. And so his aspiration is to recreate that empire that includes Ukraine. And there's a parallel piece of it that doesn't get talked about much, but that he talks about a lot. And that is his feeling that he needs to protect the 25 million Russians who he refers to as orphaned by the collapse of the Soviet Union. These are the Russians that were left behind in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan. 25% of the population of Latvia is ethnic Russian. And he feels a responsibility for protecting them. And so all those countries are looking at Russia and at Putin and his aspirations because of that ambition. And, you know, the truth is he is determined to achieve these objectives. He has not changed his objectives in Ukraine at all since the beginning of the war. I would say since the first 2 months of the war, when it became clear he couldn't seize all of Ukraine. He is determined to have all of eastern Ukraine where those Russians live, the whole Donbass, those 4 provinces. He wants a compliant, subordinate government in Kyiv. He wants a Ukrainian military that is essentially nothing but an enhanced police force. He wants Ukraine to be completely outside of the EU, outside of NATO. He wants a veto over any forces sent to participate in a security force. And he hasn't changed those aspirations at all. So how does this end? I think that the odds of an agreed ceasefire or peace, if you will, are very low. I think what is more likely to happen is if he is successful in seizing all of the Donbass, and he still has some significant elements of the Donbass that he has not yet conquered, that what you would see essentially would be a winding down of the conflict, sort of what we saw after the seizure of Crimea, so between 2014 and 2022. We have a very low level of violence. There's much reduced attacks on each other's countries, and it basically just kind of quiets down over time as things settle in. Essentially a frozen conflict to be continued at some future date. I will say, I mean, the major thing I think to understand about Putin is that he's a bully. And the only way to deal with him is to make clear you're not afraid of him. I'll just relate one anecdote from one of my meetings with him. We were putting anti-ballistic missile capabilities in Poland and the Czech Republic, and and the Russians were very much opposed to this, and we kept trying to tell him that it's about the Iranian threat, not about the Russian threat, that the technology and everything is such that what we're putting in Poland cannot defend against Russian missiles and so on. And so he pulls out this map that looked like it had been drawn by an 8th grader with colored pencils and using a compass and a protractor or whatever. And he shoves this across at me and he says, this shows the range arcs of the various Iranian missiles. And it was all wrong. And he said, and this is the best estimate of our intelligence service. And I looked at it, I turned it around, pushed it right across the table back at him, and I said, you need a new intelligence service.
Well, one follow-up on that, because you talked about what a possible, settlement, a territorial settlement could look like there, but also mentioned that with, bullies, they only understand force. What would be your prescription for U.S. policy towards Ukraine today? More support, same level, less support, different mixture?
I think the only thing that stops, the only thing that will stop Putin is force. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think we and the Europeans need to continue supporting Ukraine. What they especially need from us, I apologize, I've got a little cold. What they need from us especially is air defense. And the Europeans can provide some things to the Ukrainians, but they can't contribute much in the way of air defense. So they need a lot of air defense from us. And they need whatever other support we can give. The Europeans have done a lot. People tend not to pay much attention to it, but the truth is the dollar value of what the Europeans, they've done about $75 billion worth of help, financial and military. We've done about $65 billion. So they've actually stepped up as well as they can. They face the problem that their defense industries are so poor and so behind the times and so small that they can't do a lot on the defense side. But I think providing military equipment, especially air defense, that enables the Ukrainians to impose pain on the Russians. Now, I'm not saying we should provide them with Tomahawk missiles, but we should provide. The Ukrainians are making an impact on the Russians. Russians have stopped exporting refined hydrocarbons because of the attacks on their infrastructure and refineries and so on. There are gas lines in Moscow and St. Petersburg and throughout the country. So there is some pain being inflicted by the Ukrainians, and so giving them the capability to do more of that, I think, should be in the cards too.
So, well, building on the Russia question, but pivoting a little bit to further east, another very notable development in the last few years is this forging of a Moscow-Beijing partnership between Putin and Xi Jinping. And I remember discussing this possible entente about 20 years ago with some other national security experts and being assured that this would never happen. Russia and China's historical rivalries and different civilizational inheritances and competing interests and competition over Central Asia, it'll never happen. They're always going to be more rivals than partners. But here we are today with their professed, no limits partnership. So I guess the questions are, should the U.S. have seen this coming, and how formidable or durable of an alliance is it or not? I mean, are there some potential stress points, or is this just kind of the new reality, the new strategic reality for the foreseeable future?
So just a couple of years after I joined the CIA, the Russians and the Chinese went to war over the Amur River, and we had satellite photographs, and there were a lot of casualties on both sides. And in fact, Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin at one point asked Henry Kissinger what the U.S. reaction would be if the Soviet Union used nuclear weapons against China. So that's where the state of the alliance was, the state of the relationship. And And up to just shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were still 1 million Soviet troops on the Chinese border. And our initial cooperation with the Chinese, beginning with the Nixon visit and so on, was actually strategic. It wasn't economic. And we actually worked with the Chinese building radars in Western China to spy on Soviet missile tests. And so that's kind of the strategic nature of going back to the 70s and the 80s. I think with the advent of Putin, and particularly after 2003, 2004, and the color revolutions, and particularly the advent of Xi in 2013, and the desire on the part of both of those leaders to overturn the international order that the U.S. had created after World War II. It is that common purpose of fighting against the United States and of trying to overturn that international order that both of these countries have an interest in, and it gives them a common purpose and a common interest. I think the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, though, the degree to which the nature of the relationship has flipped from the 50s, where the Soviet Union was the big brother and the Chinese were the small little brother. And now it's the Chinese in charge, their economy, their military power, and their role in the world. The Chinese clearly want to overturn this order and displace the United States, supplant the United States, whereas Putin's objectives, it seems to me, are more disruptive. He basically just wants to tear apart the existing order led by the United States, but he's not trying to offer an alternative. So where does this go from now? They have a lot of things not in common. They have a lot of things that worry each other. The Russians publicized just a couple of months ago that they had arrested a bunch of Chinese for spying on the Russian military. And it's got to make Putin very uncomfortable, the degree to which China is investing in places like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and other places in Central Asia with huge economic resources. So I think there's a lot of underlying tensions there. So I think I would not characterize them as allies, to use a modern expression. I think the way to characterize these two countries today is friends with benefits.
Okay, so, all right. Well, continuing on that vein of China.
And we won't talk about who's doing what to whom.
Hey, this is a PG-13 forum. All right, here. So anyway, continuing on that vein with China, and you had touched on this a little bit in your opening comments, but I want to go a little deeper there. China, of course, is, at least in the long term, our most formidable peer competitor right now. And you touched some on their strengths in shipbuilding and industrial capacity. But what would be your, to use, of course, a great old Andy Marshall term, what would be your net assessment of the strategic balance between the United States and China? What are the areas of national power where the U.S. will still have an advantage, and where does China have an edge?
Well, I think far and away we have the economic advantage. We are still by far the larger economy, the more sophisticated economy, although when it comes to digital and AI and so on, the Chinese are really pushing hard and in some ways are ahead of us. But in terms of the overall size of the economy and so on, we're still well ahead. I think when it comes to strategic nuclear capabilities, we are well ahead. We are far and away much stronger than China. But they have a very aggressive expansion program for their nuclear programs, so that gap will narrow. But I think overall, net right now, I would say that we have the advantage in strategic military, and because of the quality of our submarines in particular, I would give us the edge militarily, even in Asia. But I think something that's very important to realize is that because we were able to avoid a military confrontation with the Soviet Union, The outcome of the Cold War was really determined by non-military instruments of power. Economic, technological, strategic communications, development assistance, ideology, and so on. In all of those areas, except for economic, the Chinese, I think, are outpacing us. I mentioned earlier that they're technologically quite advanced, probably ahead of us in some areas, even with us in some areas, behind us in some others, but nipping at our heels. But over the last, in the years since the end of the Cold War, we have essentially dismantled all of our other non-military instruments of power. So in 2011, Hu Jintao invested like $7 billion to create a global strategic communications capability for China. There isn't a single country on the planet where you can't get Chinese radio, television, social media, print media, internet, and so on. And, and they've simply expanded that capability throughout. And so there's, in the whole strategic communications arena, and then we, in 1998, the Congress dismantled the United States Information Agency, and it went away, was converted into the Agency for Global Media and some other things, but we've really lost our, and then the more recent actions taken this year, shutting down the Voice of America and so on. The Chinese have a voice all over the world right now, and we don't. Same thing in development assistance. I mean, there are a lot of criticisms of Belt and Road, but the Chinese now have contracted relationships under Belt and Road with 150 countries around the world, mainly in the global south, but not entirely. There are some European countries that have signed up. And they are a learning country. They've saw a lot of the problems with the debt trap and so on with Belt and Road, so they've changed the way they approach it in many respects and have become more effective. In terms of economic relationships, China's now the biggest trading partner with more than 120 countries around the world. They're the biggest trading partner with every country, I think, in South America. And we've cut our development assistance. That's been under attack for a long time. Foreign aid, quote unquote, has probably always been the most unpopular part of the federal budget. Most Americans have no idea how little we actually spend on it, but that's another issue. So my point is that these non-military instruments of power, trade, communications, development assistance, and so on, the Chinese have dramatically expanded their capabilities in all of these areas and have a presence and a role in the global south that the United States simply does not have, including diplomatically, I might add. Most of our embassies in the global south don't have an ambassador. We've cut our staffs and so on. So I guess the net on the non-military instruments of power, which was always the greatest asset the United States had in the Cold War, the Chinese have completely run away with that game as far as I'm concerned.
Mm. Well, yeah, a sobering picture. Well, to follow up on one of those elements of national power, the economic one, we've also had this fairly unprecedented situation, at least in our history, of China for the last couple of decades being America's most significant economic partner, but also our most robust strategic rival. I know for the last few years we've been going through kind of a partial decoupling of the Chinese and American economies, but we're still pretty deeply intertwined, evidenced by our recent negotiation with them over semiconductor supply chains, over rare earths, for example. And I know, particularly for one of your jobs at Rice Hadley Gates, you're thinking a lot about American economic engagement with the world. So at this juncture, should the U.S. kind of hold stable at our current level of economic engagement with China, or should we continue on the decoupling path?
Well, to give you a sense of the disparity between the Soviet Union and China, I think at the end of 2023, total U.S.-Chinese trade was a little north of $700 billion. At the high point of U.S.-Soviet trade, which was 1986, the total trade between the two countries was $5 billion. I think trying to decouple these two economies is quite unrealistic. So I think that the term that has been coined about de-risking is what we really ought to be focused on. And what we ought to be thinking about strategically is what elements of the supply chain do we really have to have here domestically? And rare earth minerals is obviously one of them, and how we got ourselves into this spot. But the Chinese really have us over a barrel. When earlier this year the Chinese cut off the supply of batteries, the Ford plants were within a week of shutting down production. So we don't have a stockpile of these batteries and rare earth minerals to speak of. And while we're out scrounging around for deals, which I think is what we ought to be doing to acquire access to rare earth minerals, the real challenge is in the refining of those rare earth minerals. The Chinese control about 70% of the supply of rare earths, but they control about 95% of the refining capability. And it's expensive, it's environmentally really dirty, and it requires certain kinds of technologies. So I think our highest priority is not only acquiring the rare earth minerals, but it's also figuring out how we're going to do the refining, or how we can help friendly countries build their refining capability. We will never be able to challenge, never is a long time. It'll be a long time before we can challenge the Chinese in terms of cost, but we just need to bear that cost. One of the little footnotes to the deal that's been cut on rare earths is that the Chinese have made clear they will not sell rare earth minerals or batteries to U.S. defense industries. And they have taken a page out of our own export control book in terms of creating something they call a validated end user certificate. So now when they're selling to a U.S. commercial firm, they want proof that that material, that those rare earths are not going to be forward sold to a defense industry, just like we do with them on chips and things like that. So they're, as I said, they're learning, and unfortunately in this case they're learning from us. And so the rare earths is one example. I think pharmaceuticals is another, where we want to make sure we have access to the base chemicals and so on. And the question is, what other areas of our economic life do we really feel we have to have domestically? And I'm not sure, maybe the people in the private sector here at UT and other universities have thought about this, but I don't think the government has thought much strategically about what, other than these two things that have been mentioned by people, what other areas do we need to have our own guaranteed supply? So I think, bottom line, de-risking versus decoupling.
Thanks. All right, one more China question, and here we'll zero in on the big Taiwan factor. So an aggressive move on Taiwan by China remains certainly the most discussed scenario for a possible war in the Western Pacific. How likely do you think some version of that is, and what are the ways that the U.S. can help deter it?
I actually think that the odds of the Chinese invading Taiwan in not just in 2027, but 2030 or whatever, in that ballpark, are very low. And the main reason is because they have so many other far less risky ways to bring pressure on Taiwan. We saw beginning after Speaker Pelosi's visit, the Chinese declared exercise areas around Taiwan, both air and maritime, that closed those areas to commercial traffic. Well, they just happened to include the maritime and air, commercial air approaches to ports and airports in Taiwan. So it really disrupted Taiwanese trade for about a week, and then the Chinese backed off. Well, in the ensuing 2 or 3 years, the Chinese have dramatically increased the number of ships and planes they have operating all around Taiwan. And they can impose these exercises and close these exercise areas anytime they want. And pretty easy to morph from that into a quarantine or even a blockade. And the thing about a quarantine of saying, well, we're going to inspect all the ships going into Taiwan, or all the planes going into Taiwan have to land in China first, and things like that, is that to reverse it, we would have to fire the first shot in a war with China. If they were to do a quarantine, in effect, we would have to attack Chinese naval ships to break the quarantine. And that means we would be the ones initiating a war with China. That would be very, very tough, I think, for this or any other U.S. president. There are also cyber tools, there are business relationships. The opposition party, the Kuomintang, actually controls the legislature in Taiwan, and they are much more favorably inclined to doing business with China than President Lai's party, the DPP. So the irony is the political avenue for a closer relationship between China and Taiwan may well be the Kuomintang, which is, of course, in the greatest of all ironies, Chiang Kai-shek's party. But that party, President Lai put forward a defense budget. That party in the legislature cut that budget by 40%. So there are a lot of different avenues, I think, where Xi can bring a lot of pressure on Taiwan without actually having to take the risk of an all-out amphibious invasion. They've never done one. There isn't a single Chinese general or admiral who has 1 day of combat experience. He's fired 20 generals in the last 6 months. He's fired 3 defense ministers. He's fired 2 different vice chairs of the Central Military Commission. He's been fighting corruption in the Chinese military since he took office a dozen years ago. I don't think he trusts his military. And having watched what the Russians have been through in Ukraine, I think he also has a better appreciation of the risks of military operations. So for all these reasons, I think that an outright invasion is a pretty low probability. Of course, that's exactly the kind of prediction that ultimately comes up and bites you in the ass, but that's the way it goes. But for all these reasons, I think the odds are very low.
Thanks. Well, we can't have a national security discussion without mentioning the Middle East. And among other things, of course, a region of great concern to the United States, but also to Russia and China, which we've been talking about here. And over the past few years, there really seems to have been a revolution in the strategic architecture of the region, right? You've got the Abraham Accords aligning some of the Arab powers, especially Gulf monarchies, more with Israel. Of course, Israel's multi-pronged campaigns against Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. And of course, America's most recent notable use of military force with our bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites a few months ago. Some of Israel's adversaries, some of America's historic adversaries have certainly seen their combat power really degraded. But the region still seems pretty unstable and volatile. So what will be the key factors that shape the near-term future of the Middle East, and what should American priorities be?
Actually, and I thought, even 6 months or a year ago, I don't think these words would have ever escaped my lips, but I think the Middle East is actually a place that's looking pretty promising these days.
Okay.
And particularly if you look at all the other problems going on in the world.
You heard it. He's long on the Middle East. All right. So, okay.
You have the UAE and Saudi Arabia undergoing radical reforms. And people will tell you, if you haven't been to Saudi Arabia in a year, you have not been to Saudi Arabia. The changes that are taking place are truly dramatic, and diversification of the economy, reform of society, and so on and so forth. Same thing with the UAE. They are interested in doing business. Qatar, Bahrain, same thing. And what you've seen is a dramatic change in the strategic equation in the Middle East since the October 7th massacre by Hamas. You have seen, in that 2 years, you've seen Assad fall in Syria. You've seen attacks by Israel and then by Israel and the United States on Iran and its nuclear program. You've seen a dramatic weakening of Hezbollah, a dramatic weakening of Hamas. The Houthis are still a problem, but they're basically geographically constrained. And Iran is still a problem. There's no question about that. But there's also no question in my mind that the Israelis are fully prepared, as the saying goes, to mow the grass. And if the Iranians try and rebuild that nuclear program, the Israelis will go right back. And maybe you're with or without U.S. support. So the destabilizing elements of the Middle East, Iran and its surrogates, have been dramatically weakened over the last couple of years. And I think if this ceasefire holds in Gaza and you actually can move to the next step or two, it's pretty clear to me that the Saudis will not move toward normalizing diplomatic relations with Israel unless there is some move, some statement or something from the Israelis in terms of a two-state solution or a state for the Palestinians. It could be, I think if Netanyahu just sort of mumbled it in his sleep one night, I think they basically just need a fig leaf. But I don't, unless there is that fig leaf, unless there is something in the direction of something for the Palestinians, I don't think that the Saudis will take the next step to join the Abraham Accords. But I think it's the change in the Middle East is just remarkable over the last couple of years, and Israel's strategic superiority over all of its neighbors is without question. So I think that this is an area that, particularly if this ceasefire can hold and move forward, and that's a big if, granted, but I think right now there's a lot of opportunity in the Middle East, and when we're advising business clients and so on, we're saying this is a place you should take very seriously.
You didn't expect to be getting stock tips here today, but there you go, folks. All right, so all right. Your most recent government service was as Secretary of Defense in both the Bush and Obama administrations. How would you assess the overall strength of our military today, especially on force posture, weapons platforms? And then I have to follow up on that. Something I know you worked very hard on during your time as Secretary of Defense, particularly with the MRAP, is reforming the acquisition and procurement process, which is, seems to have become something of a crisis. So overall strength, funding, posturing, and then the processes.
Well, I have sort of what might appear to be contradictory views on the defense budget. I think there is significant room for reform in the defense budget, and I'm not talking about procurement. I'm talking about the budget itself. Mm-hmm. When I was secretary, most of my predecessors as secretary, if they were lucky, cut one or two programs. Major legacy programs. I remember when Dick Cheney was secretary under the first President Bush, he cut two programs. One was the A-12 joint fighter. The litigation for that ended when I was secretary 20 years later. And the other program he cut, quote unquote cut, was the Osprey, which is still flying. Mm-hmm. But in 2009, with the cooperation and frankly a collaborative effort with the military and the civilian sides of the Pentagon, we cut 36 major legacy programs. And if they had been built to completion, they would have cost the taxpayers $330 billion. The next year, we identified $180 billion in overhead costs, cuts. So there's a lot of room for going in and getting rid of legacy programs that aren't working, aren't relevant anymore, and so on. And part of the problem with procurement today, and particularly new technologies, is that the services still are so preoccupied with protecting the legacy programs in their programs of record that it makes it difficult to find room in their budgets to invest in new capabilities. Now, there's been progress made in this, but it's been very slow and very painful. So my view is there's a lot of room for reform and for efficiencies and cutting overhead and cutting costs in the Defense Department, cutting legacy programs. But that said, I also think we need to be spending more on defense. That the current level of investment, given the programs that are underway in China in particular, but also even in Russia, I think make that necessary. But here's the rub. The Department of Defense has not had an enacted budget at the beginning of the fiscal year in 15 years. Every year for the last 15 years, the Defense Department has operated on a continuing resolution for a few weeks, a few months, or a whole year. Here's the deal on a continuing resolution. You can't start anything new. You can't change contracts, meaning you can't add to the numbers of capabilities you're buying. So this chaos on the Hill is not only not new, it has an enduring impact over time. How can you plan? How can you make sensible management decisions if you have no idea how much money you're going to have, even well into the fiscal year? And like I say, it just builds year after year after year. So the budgeting process on the Hill is in desperate need of reform. And then the final thing I would say is that there's a lot of rhetoric about rebuilding the defense industrial complex, about rebuilding our defense industries and so on. But if you can't pass a budget, you can't invest in those capabilities. So for all the rhetoric, nothing's happening. Talk about building new shipyards, expanding the ones we have, great. But until you can appropriate some dollars to do that, nothing's happening. And this goes to the procurement issue of new technologies. And here, Will, I would just say, there are those, particularly in the new defense industries and the AI advocates and so on, that basically say get rid of all the legacy programs and just do drones and stuff like that. My view is what you have to have, if legacy programs were of no value, then why is China building so many? And so my view is what is needed is a much more creative approach to blending the capabilities of legacy programs that still have value and new technologies, whether it's drones or a host of other kinds of technologies, where those two operate. And I think the Air Force is experimenting with it in terms of having a manned fighter with a drone as the wingman, if you will. And so there are some things moving in this direction, but they tend to be more experimental and still working on it. All those things need to be dramatically accelerated, and figuring out a way to, we produced, when we did the MRAPs, mine resistant ambush protected vehicles, I made the decision to do that in the spring of 2007, and we started airlifting the first MRAPs to Iraq, I think 5 months later. That's the first time that a major procurement program for defense has gone from decision to full-scale industrial production in less than a year since World War II. That's the kind of production, and we've ended up building 27,000 of them at a cost of $40 billion. That's what we need to be able to do with drones and some of these other capabilities. We need to be able to scale up the manufacturing and production to huge numbers. The thousands and thousands and thousands of drones that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are using give a sense of the scale of the use of these things in actual combat. And we're way behind the power curve in that regard.
So over the last 75 years, one unique attribute of America's, I think, national security posture has been our network of alliances, especially in Asia and Europe. Of late, those alliances have come under some criticism and tension. Now, are our allies still an asset and source of strength, or are these maybe the geopolitical version of some of these legacy structures and programs that served us well for a time but have just kind of outlived their usefulness?
I'm sorry, start the...
About our allies going back 75 years, and if they're still useful.
Churchill once said the only thing worse than having allies is not having allies. And I would argue that our allies and our alliances are still incredibly important. And unlike the Russian-Chinese relationship, these are not just alliances of power, but of values. Our allies are all democracies. We share with those allies democratic values. We pay attention. This is the Europeans, the Japanese, the Philippines, the South Koreans. These are alliances of like-minded countries that have similar aspirations for their people and for the rest of the world. Nobody, I and my predecessors and most of my successors berated the Allies for a long time about their failure to step up after the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of their own defense spending. I told in my last speech to NATO, I said, I'm the last senior national security official you will ever encounter from the United States who actually remembers the role that NATO played in the Cold War and has an emotional attachment to NATO. My successors, and not just those in the Defense Department, but political leaders in the United States, in the White House and in the Congress, do not have that, in the future will not have that attachment, and they will look at this relationship in a cost-benefit analysis, and you're going to come up short. It took two people to get the Europeans to finally get moving in terms of making serious investments in their defense capabilities. One was Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, and the other was Donald Trump. And by creating doubts in the minds of Europeans, and I'm sure many of us have concerns about that, but the fact is, by creating doubts about whether the United States would be there for them if Putin came further west, he finally got them off their duff. And finally, they're now committing 3.5%, 4%, 5% for national defense. We'll see if they actually follow through. The European governments don't have any money. Most of them are facing some real financial challenges. So they've made the commitment. Whether they actually follow through with the currency, with the cash, remains to be seen. But at least they've made the commitment. But I think those alliances remain strong. I think those countries want to remain associated with the United States. I think we understand the value that they have for us. But I think it's very important in the eyes of the American people that they're finally stepping up, because the fact is they have, in fact, been free riders for the last 30 years.
Over the course of your career, you served under multiple U.S. presidents.
Starting with LBJ.
That's right, starting with LBJ, honored right up here on the Hill. Who were the most notable presidents you worked for, and what would you say were some of the most distinctive attributes? I phrase that very neutrally to everyone. You notice that? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
I think that the presidents that I admired the most were presidents that fostered a free give and take and true debate in the Situation Room on issues, that were willing to encourage contrary points of view and encourage people to argue in front of them, back and forth. And I would say this included President Reagan, both Bushes, and President Obama. encouraged debate. And in fact, under the second President Bush, he would say, does anybody have anything to say? Anything they want to add? Under Obama, it was more like a classroom, and he called on everybody, and you better have your homework. And he not only would call on everybody at the table, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? He'd go around the back bench, ask the people in the back bench what they thought. There were a couple of times when he took the advice of people on the back bench. Now, I will say, in one of those cases, Libya, it was a terrible mistake. But they encouraged debate. So not only were willing to have strong people around them, but they encouraged those people to debate those issues, to debate the issues, let them hear contrary points of view. And I think that was really important. I think the other is when presidents take actions that they know are incredibly risky politically, but they do what they think is the right thing for the country. I think George H.W. Bush's decision to sign the budget deal with the Congress that in fact paved the way for the economic prosperity of the 90s and actually a budget surplus in the Clinton administration is one example. And it did cost him the election. When President Bush ordered the surge in Iraq in January of 2007, it was incredibly politically risky. I'd been sitting in the Situation Room in 1980 when President Carter ordered the Operation Eagle Claw, the operation to the Desert One rescue mission to rescue the American hostages in Iran. So fast forward almost exactly 30 years later, spring of 2011, when President Obama ordered the attack to get bin Laden. People don't realize we did not have one shred of concrete evidence that bin Laden was in that facility. Not one. It was totally a circumstantial case. It basically was a 50-50 crapshoot. And that contributed to Carter losing the election in 1980. This could have cost Obama the election, not election, but cost him as well politically. But all of them made these decisions that they thought were in the best interest of the country. So those two things, the willingness to encourage debate and then the willingness to take actions that could cost them politically, but they thought were the right thing for the country. The final thing I would say is, the other thing that I think is important is a sense of humor. And the truth is, for me, a sense of humor reflects a person who's at ease with himself and has self-awareness and so on. And I'll just share one anecdote. First of all, out of the 8 presidents I worked for, 2 had no discernible sense of humor. One was Richard Nixon and the other was Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan, I was briefing Reagan before his first meeting with Gorbachev in 1985. And we're sitting in the Oval Office, and George Shultz is there, and all the poobahs. And I'm sitting at the end of the couch, and he's sitting in the wing back here, and I'm seated right there, and I'm briefing him. And I hear this terrible screeching noise, and he reaches up and he adjusts his hearing aid in his left ear. And he had kind of winced. If I could hear it, I knew it had to be painful. Another couple of minutes went by, I went on with my briefing, and all of a sudden this really terrible screech, and he kind of screwed up his face, and he pulled his hearing aid out of his ear and he pounded it in his hand, and as he was putting it back in his ear, he leaned over and whispered to me, "It's my KGB handler trying to reach me."
Oh, okay. Awesome. I'm a sucker for a Reagan joke, all right, so, yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. So, Okay, final question from me. Obviously, we've got a range of ages represented in the room here, and this one is for all the young people out there. We've got a lot of students here today who are looking at the world they're inheriting, and many of them are considering careers of some sort or work in national security. What advice would you have for a student in the audience today who's thinking about a national security career?
Well, I guess my main advice would be do it. The country desperately needs you. I think one of the great costs of the DOGE effort earlier this year was the firing of probationary employees in state and defense and CIA and elsewhere. These were all the young people, people coming out of the LBJ school and the Bush school and others who were committed to public service and wanted to do public service and frankly were the future of these organizations. So I guess that's the bad news. The good news is there are going to be a lot of openings. But I think, I never intended to make a career out of national security or working for the government. But they just kept offering me interesting jobs. And I've never worked with such an extraordinary group of people. And being able to sit there and know, even as a young analyst at CIA, I'm sitting there, I'm 24 years old, and I'm writing a short piece that's going to be in the President's Daily Brief the next day. So I'm communicating, as a 24-year-old, I'm communicating directly with the President of the United States in terms of what I think is going to happen in a given situation. So there's really an enormous amount of gratification in a public service career and doing public service. And I would add another thing, and that is, you don't have to think about it in terms of an entire career, 30 years. Do it for 5 years. Do it for 10 years. But First President Bush said, there is no definition of a full life that does not include public service. So I think that's really critical.
Thanks. We just have a few minutes left, so we can take an audience question or two. So if we have any, and we've got some mics going around. So all right, here's a hand right here in the front row. That's right. Thank you, Henderson. Okay.
Hi, I'm Alec. As I understand, you said the defense and industrial complex is rebuilding it will be easier said than done. How are policymakers and analysts taking into account that without a whole new generation of skilled labor and hands-on engineers and blue-collar workers, increasing manufacturing substantially in both the defense and civilian areas will be very difficult, to say the least?
Well, it's a good question, and I would say they understand. I think the people who are focused on this understand your point intellectually, but figuring out how to solve it is a much more difficult and complicated problem. Now, a lot of companies are starting their own apprenticeship programs for kids out of high school or kids even out of college to teach them these skills. There are I've read as many as 6 million jobs well-paying jobs going begging in this country that require skills that we just don't have, technical skills, and in manufacturing. And so I think it's a combination of company initiatives, more collaboration, particularly with community colleges, and a return in our high schools to actually what was a big deal when I was a kid, and that was vocational education and giving kids exposure early to the kinds of things that you do in manufacturing and welding and so on and so forth. The high school in my little rural area in the northernmost part of Washington State has a big welding program. And so I think, and other skills like that. So I think it's a combination of educators, industry, and then whatever government can do to try and encourage it.
For our last question, we're going to turn to a man who's very special to many of us in this room. One thing Secretary Gates and I have in common is we've both been mentored in our younger days by Admiral Bob Inman. And Admiral Inman is right here in the front row, so we're going to give him the last word, a comment, a question, a word of wisdom. So, Admiral, here comes Henderson with the microphone. So, yeah.
We have a new prime minister in Japan, lady who describes herself as the Iron Maiden, compares herself to Margaret Thatcher. Describe for the audience your dealings with Margaret Thatcher.
It was my good fortune to have a number of dealings with Margaret Thatcher over the years. I was the only person working in the White House when she became prime minister who was still working in the White House when she was thrown out 11 years later. And she changed Britain, and she saved Britain. And when Tony Blair was elected, the Labor prime minister was elected a couple of years after she left and after John Major left, somebody said, who won the election? And the answer was Margaret Thatcher, because Blair adopted many of the policies that Thatcher had adopted. But I will share one of a Margaret Thatcher anecdote. Gorbachev was withdrawing forces from Eastern Europe, and we were being slow under First President Bush to respond, and Bush felt that we had to seize the initiative and begin to draw down some of our forces in Europe. And so we put together a plan, Defense Department and the White House and State, put together a plan of what we would draw down, and the Deputy Secretary of State at the time was Larry Eagleburger. And the President wanted to give the leaders in Europe a heads up about what he was planning and get their reaction. So he sent Larry Eagleburger and I to meet with Thatcher, Helmut Kohl in Germany, Francois Mitterrand in France, and Andreotti in Italy. And we figured we'd do Thatcher first, because we figured if we could get through her, the others would be a piece of cake. She was not happy, and she didn't like it, but she finally said, well, if the president wants to do this, fine. So then he did a second round of these 3 months later, and he sent Eagleburger and I back. And she greets us very icily, and we're meeting in her parlor. She says, won't you take your accustomed seats? And that was the signal that she was not in a good frame of mind. And we did it, and she finally agreed. But we're walking out, and she has her arm on each of our shoulders as we're walking out of number 10 Downing. And she's smiling and very nice. And she says, you two are welcome in my house anytime. Her hands dropped, and then her face froze, and she said, but never again on this topic. And then the next day she calls Bush, and she says, well, I met with Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And I always claim to be Tweedledee.
Please join me in thanking Secretary Gates.